A Vietnam veteran was arrested on his own porch, accused of trespassing on the very land he had lived on for 40 years. Behind the outrage stood a powerful bank, hiding behind paperwork and procedure to strip him of his home. Yet with the help of an unlikely ally in court, the truth surfaced in a way no one expected. But just wait until you hear the stunning twist that turned this tragedy into a triumph, and how justice at last prevailed. The evening was calm in a quiet Texas neighborhood. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a soft glow of amber light across the small houses and freshly cut lawns. Thomas Reed, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran, stepped out onto his wooden porch with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had seen much in life. His back was a little bent, his hands rough from years of work, but there was dignity in the way he carried himself. For him, this house was not just a building. It was the fortress he had built brick by brick after returning from war, the place where every nail and every wall carried a story. That night, he simply wanted to check the shed in his backyard. It was routine, something he did every evening. But as he walked down the steps, headlights suddenly cut across his yard. Within seconds, the quiet street transformed into a scene of chaos. Two police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of his property, their red and blue lights flashing like a warning siren to the entire neighborhood. Thomas froze, confused. This was his home. He had lived here for 4 decades, yet the scene unfolding felt as though he had become a stranger on his own land. A young officer stepped out of the vehicle, his voice sharp and commanding. "You are under arrest for trespassing on private property." The words didn't make sense. For a moment, Thomas thought it had to be a mistake, some kind of mix-up that would be cleared with a simple explanation. He gave a small, almost disbelieving smile and replied in a steady voice, "This is my home. I've lived here for 40 years." But his words seemed to vanish into thin air. The officer didn't respond. Instead, another officer approached from behind, and before Thomas could even process what was happening, cold steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The veteran who had once faced enemy fire now stood shackled on the porch he built with his own hands. Neighbors began to gather at their windows, drawn by the flashing lights and the raised voices. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted. A few even stepped out onto their lawns, whispering in disbelief. To them, Thomas was more than a neighbor. He was the man who helped repair fences, who waved every morning, who wore his old military cap proudly when walking to the mailbox. Now they watched him being led away, like an intruder on the very property they had seen him care for year after year. Their confusion turned quickly into outrage. How could such a thing even happen? What kind of world was this, where a man could be arrested for standing on his own porch? As Thomas was placed against the police car, the flashing lights painted his weathered face in harsh red and blue. Anger spread not only through the crowd of neighbors, but through the very air itself. It was the kind of anger born from witnessing injustice with your own eyes, raw, undeniable, and unforgettable. The night that began in silence had now erupted into a storm that would mark the start of a battle Thomas Reed never expected to fight, one not on foreign soil, but right in his own front yard. The bright lights of the police station were nothing like the warm glow of Thomas Reed's porch. Inside those sterile walls, everything felt impersonal. Papers shuffled, phones rang, and officers moved about with mechanical efficiency. For Thomas, it was as though he had been dropped into another world, one where his words no longer carried weight. A clerk at the front desk barely looked up as an officer explained the charge, trespassing on private property. To Thomas, the phrase still sounded absurd, almost laughable, except that no one else in the room was laughing. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and led past rows of cells, the iron doors clanging shut behind him. Finally, a man in a tailored suit appeared, briefcase in hand. He introduced himself as the bank's representative. With rehearsed authority, he explained that the house Thomas had called home for 40 years had been sold at auction. According to their records, Thomas had defaulted on his mortgage. Thomas's voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and desperation. "That's impossible. I paid off that mortgage 20 years ago. I have the receipts, the documents, everything." But the lawyer simply opened his briefcase and produced papers that bore the bank's seal, stamped and signed. They looked official, undeniable to anyone who saw them. To the system, a signature on a page carried more weight than a lifetime of memories, sweat, and sacrifice. When the lawyer left, Thomas sat alone in the small concrete cell. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small case. Inside was his Purple Heart, worn but polished, the medal awarded for wounds sustained in battle. He held it tightly, the cool metal pressing against his skin, a reminder of the years he had given to the country that now treated him as if he were a stranger. The walls of the cell seemed to close in. He thought of his son stationed overseas, wearing the same uniform Thomas once wore. His boy was serving with pride, believing in duty, honor, and country, values Thomas himself had lived by. Yet here he was dishonored not by an enemy abroad, but by a system at home that had failed him. The pain of that realization cut deeper than any wound he had carried from the battlefield. For the officers, it was just procedure. They processed him the same way they processed dozens of others each week. For the bank, it was nothing more than a clerical mistake, a misfiled document in a sea of paperwork. But for Thomas, it was the unraveling of a lifetime. Every nail he hammered, every dollar he saved, every moment he had spent building a home for his family, all of it was being erased by lines of text on a page. As he sat in silence, the medal still clutched in his hand. He felt a hollow ache in his chest. It was not just about losing a house. It was about losing trust in the very system he had once risked everything to protect. The man who had survived war was now fighting a quieter, crueler battle, one where the enemy wore no uniform, carried no weapon, and yet had the power to take everything from him with a stamp and a signature. The courthouse was an imposing building of stone and glass, a place where lives could change with a single ruling. For Thomas Reed, walking into that courtroom felt heavier than any mission he had faced decades ago. This time, there were no comrades at his side, no commanding officer to give direction, only a young attorney, Rebecca Miller, who had been assigned to represent him. Rebecca was in her early 30s, sharp-minded but cautious. She had handled small cases before, but nothing of this scale. The moment she saw the bank's legal team, 3 polished attorneys with stacks of documents and an air of practiced confidence, her heart sank. How could she, one lawyer with limited resources, stand against them? But then she turned to Thomas. He sat quietly, his posture straight, despite his age, his weathered hands folded on the table. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only a kind of quiet resilience. When he spoke to her about his house, he didn't describe it in legal terms. He described the tree he planted in the backyard when his son was born, the porch he rebuilt after a storm, the garden his late wife had tended. It wasn't just property, it was a life lived. In that moment, Rebecca stopped seeing him as just another client. She saw him as a soldier, still standing, even when the odds were stacked against him, and with a steady voice she made him a promise. "We're going to fight this, Mr. Reed." The trial began. The bank's lawyers went first, presenting documents with bold signatures and stamped seals. They spoke with authority, painting a picture of numbers and missed payments. To the jury, it sounded neat, orderly, and convincing. Then it was Rebecca's turn. She stood, her notes trembling slightly in her hand, but her voice grew stronger with every word. She called Thomas to the stand. The veteran rose slowly, his footsteps echoing across the courtroom floor. When he took his seat, the silence was absolute. He spoke about serving his country, about returning home to build a life from nothing, about the pride he felt the day he made his final mortgage payment. His words weren't polished like the bank's lawyers, but they carried something far more powerful: truth. Rebecca followed by presenting the evidence Thomas had kept for decades: faded receipts, stamped letters, and bank records that proved the loan had been paid in full. The jury leaned forward. Even the judge studied the papers with unusual attention. For the first time, the tide began to shift. The polished arguments of the bank seemed less certain, their confidence shaken by the weight of real proof. The room, once filled with the hum of legal jargon, grew still. Thomas sat quietly, his Purple Heart pinned to his jacket, as the truth he had carried alone for years finally found its voice. And in that silence, a fragile but undeniable hope took root. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against a system too big to fight. The courtroom was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the judge, who stood tall behind the bench, a thick stack of documents spread before him. His gavel rested on the desk, but it was his words everyone was waiting for. Thomas Reed sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, his heart pounding like it hadn't since the battlefield. Beside him, Rebecca Miller straightened her shoulders, bracing for the final decision. The judge cleared his throat. His voice carried a weight that filled the chamber. "Case dismissed. The property is restored to its rightful owner. Furthermore, the bank is ordered to pay damages for emotional distress. For a moment, it didn't feel real. The words hung in the air, almost too powerful to believe. Thomas lowered his head, his eyes closing as tears welled. He drew in a deep breath, slow, steady, freeing. It was as if, after years of silent struggle, he was breathing true freedom again. Then the silence shattered. Applause erupted from the gallery, echoing through the chamber. Neighbors who had come to support him stood to their feet. Even a few police officers who had once been the enforcers of his wrongful arrest joined in the ovation. The room that had once felt cold and merciless now pulsed with warmth, with humanity, with justice. Rebecca smiled through tears. She placed a steady hand on Thomas's shoulder, whispering, "We did it." But Thomas only shook his head softly and replied, "No, we all did." News of the verdict spread like wildfire. Within hours, local stations broadcast his story, and by the next day, headlines appeared across the nation. Veteran wins back home in landmark case. Letters began arriving in piles, words of gratitude, admiration, and solidarity from strangers who felt his struggle as their own. Some wrote to say his story gave them courage to fight their own battles. Others simply thanked him for reminding the country what resilience looked like. Back in his neighborhood, the support became tangible. Neighbors showed up at his door with home-cooked meals. Volunteers gathered to repair the damage to his house, patching the walls, fixing the roof, and restoring the garden his wife once loved. Each hammer strike, each brush of paint was more than just labor. It was a community giving back to a man who had given everything. When reporters asked him how he felt, Thomas stood on the same porch where his nightmare had begun. The evening light washed over his weathered face as he spoke with steady conviction. "I fought for this country. Today, it finally fought for me." His words struck a chord that resonated far beyond his street, his town, or even his state. They became a reminder that no matter how overwhelming the system may seem, truth has a voice. And as his story spread, it carried with it a message of unshakable hope. That even when the odds are stacked high, justice can prevail if you stand tall, refuse to give up, and believe in the power of what is right.